$0.2 trillion income.
We'll leave the last few moments of this border security hearing to go live to London, where British Prime Minister Theresa May is giving a statement about the ongoing Brexit negotiations. This is live on C-SPAN 2.
Before turning to Brexit, let me touch on two significant conclusions from the other business of the Council. First, we expressed our utmost concern over the escalation we have seen at the Kerch Straits and the Sea of Azov, and Russia's continued violations of international law. We agreed to roll over economic sanctions against Russia, and we stand ready to further strengthen our support, in particular for the affected areas of Ukraine. And second, we also agreed to work together on tackling the spread of deliberate, large-scale and systematic disinformation, including as part of hybrid warfare. On this, I outlined some of the world-leading work that the UK is doing in this field. And I was clear that after we've left the European Union, the UK will continue to work closely with our European partners to uphold the international rules-based system and to keep all our people safe. And that is why it is right that our Brexit deal includes the deepest security partnership that has ever been agreed with the EU. Mr. Speaker, at this Council, I faithfully and firmly reflected the concerns of this House over the Northern Ireland backstop. I explained that the assurances we had already agreed with the EU were insufficient for this House, and we had to go further in showing that we never want to use this backstop, and if it is used, it must be a temporary arrangement. Some of the resulting exchanges at this Council were robust, but I make no apology. I make no apology for standing up for the interests of this House and the interests of our whole United Kingdom. In response, the EU27 published a series of conclusions. They made clear that it is their, and I quote, firm determination to work speedily on a subsequent agreement that establishes by the 31st of December 2020 alternative arrangements so that the backstop will not need to be triggered. The House will forgive me, but I think this bears repeating. The backstop will not need to be triggered. They underlined that if the backstop were nevertheless to be triggered, it would apply temporarily. They said that in this event, the EU would use its best endeavours to negotiate and conclude expeditiously a subsequent agreement that would replace the backstop. And they gave a new assurance in relation to the future partnership with the UK to make it even less likely that the backstop would ever be needed, by stating that the EU stands ready to embark on preparations immediately after signature of the withdrawal agreement to ensure that negotiations can start as soon as possible after the UK's withdrawal. Mr. Speaker, in these conclusions, in their statements at the Council and in their private meetings with me, my fellow EU leaders could not have been clearer. They do not want to use this backstop. They want to agree the best possible future relationship with us. There is no plot to keep us in the backstop. Indeed, President Macron said on Friday, quote, "We can clarify and reassure. The backstop is not our objective, it is not a durable solution, and nobody is trying to lock the UK into the backstop." As formal conclusions from a European Council, these commitments have legal status and should be welcomed. They go further than the EU has ever done previously in trying to address the concerns of this House. And of course, they sit on top of the commitments that we have already negotiated in relation to the backstop, including ensuring the customs element is UK-wide, that both sides are legally committed to using best endeavours to have our new relationship in place before the end of the implementation period, that if the new relationship isn't ready, we can choose to extend the implementation period instead of the backstop coming into force, that if the backstop does come in, we can use alternative arrangements, not just the future relationship to get out of it, that the treaty is clear the backstop can only ever be temporary, and that there is an explicit termination clause. But, Mr. Speaker, I know that this House is still deeply uncomfortable about the backstop, and I understand that, and I want us to go further still in the reassurances we secure. Discussions with my EU partners, including Presidents Tusk, Juncker and others, have shown that further clarification following the Council's conclusions is in fact possible. So discussions are continuing to explore further political and legal assurances. And we are also looking closely at new ways of empowering the House of Commons to ensure that any provision for a backstop has democratic legitimacy.
This is very irregular. The statement must be heard. There will be a full opportunity for exchanges, but the statement by the Prime Minister must be heard, and heard with courtesy. The Prime Minister.
For empowering the House of Commons to ensure that any provision for a backstop has democratic legitimacy, and to enable the House to place its own obligations on the government to ensure that the backstop cannot be in place indefinitely. But it is now only just over 14 weeks until the UK leaves the EU, and I know many members of this House are concerned that we need to take a decision soon. Am I right? My right honourable friend, the Leader of the House, will set out business on Thursday in the usual way. But I can confirm today that we intend to return to the meaningful vote debate in the week commencing 7th of January and hold the vote the following week. Mr. Speaker, when we have the vote, members will need to reflect carefully on what is in the best interests of our country. I know that there are a range of very strongly held personal views on this issue across the House, and I respect all of them. But expressing our personal views is not what we are here to do. We asked the British people to take this decision. 472 current members of this House voted for the referendum in June 2015, with just 32 voting against. And the British people responded by instructing us to leave the European Union. Similarly, 438 current members of this House voted to trigger Article 50 to set the process of our departure in motion, with only 85 of today's members voting against. Now, we must honour our duty to finish the job. I know this is not everyone's perfect deal. It is a compromise. But if we let the perfect be the enemy of the good, then we risk leaving the EU with no deal. Of course, we have prepared for no deal. And tomorrow the Cabinet will be discussing the next phase in ensuring that we are ready for that scenario. But let us not risk the jobs, services and security of the people we serve by turning our backs on an agreement with our neighbours that honours the referendum and provides for a smooth and orderly exit. Avoiding no deal is only possible if we can reach an agreement, or if we abandon Brexit entirely. And as I said in the debate earlier this month, do not imagine that if we vote this down, a different deal is going to miraculously appear. If you want proof, look at the conclusions of this Council. As President Juncker said, it is the best deal possible and the only deal possible. And any proposal for the future relationship, whether Norway, Canada or any other variety that has been mentioned, would require agreeing this withdrawal agreement. The Leader of the Opposition, as well as some others, are trying to pretend they could do otherwise. This is a fiction. Finally, let us not break faith with the British people by trying to stage another referendum. Another vote which would do irreparable damage to the integrity of our politics.
Order. There are many members of this House, including an illustrious chair of a select committee, who are heckling noisily and Mr. Angus Brendan McNeill, you're a cheeky chappie, but we need much less of the cheek and more by way of courtesy in listening to the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister.
Thank you. Another vote which would do irreparable damage to the integrity of our politics, because it would say to millions who trusted in democracy that our democracy does not deliver. That's right. Another vote which would likely leave us no further forward than the last. And another vote which would further divide our country at the very moment we should be working to unite it. And let us not follow the Leader of the Opposition in thinking about what gives him the best chance of forcing a general election. For at this critical moment in our history, we should be thinking not about our party's interests, but about the national interest. Let us find a way to come together and work together in the national interest to see this Brexit through. Mr. Speaker, I will work tirelessly over these next few weeks to fulfil my responsibility as Prime Minister to find a way forwards. Over the last 2 weeks, I've met quite a number of colleagues, and I'm happy to continue to do so on this important issue, so we can fulfil our responsibilities to the British people. So together we can take back control of our borders, laws and money, while protecting the jobs, the security and the integrity of our precious United Kingdom. So together we can move on to finalising the future relationship with the European Union and the trade deals with the rest of the world that can fuel our prosperity for years to come. And so together we can get this Brexit done and shift the national focus to our domestic priorities, investing in our NHS, our schools and housing, tackling the injustices that so many still face, and building a country that truly works for everyone. For these are the ways in which together this House will best serve the interests of the British people, and I commend this statement to the House.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Prime Minister for an advance copy of her statement. On Ukraine, as NATO has said, we need both sides to show restraint and de-escalate with international law adhered to, including Russia allowing unhindered access to Ukraine's ports on the Sea of Azov. Mr. Speaker, we face an unprecedented situation. The Prime Minister has led us into a national crisis. And if any more evidence was needed of why we face this grave situation, the Prime Minister demonstrated it last week's summit. There were some warm words drafted, and the Prime Minister even managed to negotiate those away to be replaced by words about preparing for no deal. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister boasted, "I had a robust discussion with President Juncker," but that cannot hide the cold reality that she achieved nothing. Standing at the dispatch box last week, the Prime Minister said, "I have made some progress." Mr. Speaker, she has not made any progress at all. The Prime Minister said so herself while still in Brussels, and I quote, "The EU is clear, as am I, that this is the deal." The European Commission has been categorical. It will not be renegotiated. The EU Council has given the clarification that were possible at this stage, so no further meetings with the UK are foreseen. The deal is unchanged and not going to change. The House must get on with the vote and move on to consider the realistic alternatives. There can be no logical reason for this delay, except that in taking shambolic government to a new level, the Prime Minister no longer has the backing of her cabinet. The International Trade Secretary suggested that the Prime Minister's deal no longer has the backing of the cabinet. It's worth quoting his words. And I quote, "I think that it is very difficult to support the deal if we don't get changes to the backstop. I don't think it will get through. I'm not even sure if the Cabinet will agree for it to be put to the House of Commons."
Yeah, well, we've seen that.
So we had the spectacle of the last few days with numerous Cabinet members coming forward with their own alternatives. The International Trade Secretary suggested that a 2-year transition to no deal is an option. The Work and Pensions Secretary says the government needs to try something different and build a consensus in Parliament. The Attorney General is reported as saying he wants her gone and for the deal to be renegotiated, while the International Development Secretary is allegedly liaising with the ERG to launch an alternative option. Others are reportedly working on a second referendum. But even if Cabinet no longer backs the deal, then who knows what the options would be? So can the Prime Minister answer this? 1. Does her deal still have the confidence of the Cabinet? 2. Is Cabinet collective responsibility still in operation? 3. Does it remain government policy to avoid a no-deal outcome? Mr. Speaker, an unacceptable deal is on the table. No amendment has been secured, renegotiations have been rebuffed, and not even mere assurances have been offered. And the Prime Minister's shoddy deal no longer even has the backing of the Cabinet. The Prime Minister ran away from putting her deal before Parliament because even her own Cabinet has doubts, and she herself admits Parliament won't back it. So we're left edging ever closer to the 29th of March deadline without a deal and without even an agreed plan in Cabinet to get a deal. The Prime Minister has cynically run down the clock, trying to manoeuvre Parliament into a choice between two unacceptable outcomes, her deal or no deal. The country, workers and businesses are increasingly anxious. Even yesterday, the CBI said uncertainty is throttling firms and threatening jobs, not in the future, but right now. The British Chamber of Commerce has said there is no time to waste. A responsible Prime Minister would, for the good of this country, have put this deal before the House this week. This week, so we could move on from this government's disastrous negotiations. This, Mr. Speaker, is a constitutional crisis, and the Prime Minister is the architect of it. She's leading the most shambolic and chaotic government in modern British history. Even Cabinet no longer functions. A Prime Minister whose authority has been lost. A Cabinet disintegrating into cliques and factions, and a Conservative Party so fundamentally split that its very existence is being discussed. It is clear, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister has failed to renegotiate her deal, failed to get any meaningful reassurances. There is no excuse for any more dither or delay. This government, Mr. Speaker, has already become the first government in British history to be held in contempt by Parliament. The debate on the meaningful vote was pulled at the last minute, and the Prime Minister has now wasted 5 weeks having achieved nothing. Not a single word renegotiated, not a single reassurance gained. This last week has embodied the failure, chaos and indecision at the heart of this government's shambolic handling of Brexit. Today, they've been dragged kicking and screaming to announce a date to restart the debate. But, Mr. Speaker, it is...
Mr. Ellis, you're a distinguished ornament of a government department, a representative of the executive branch. Be good, man. You can do so much better when you try. Mr. Jeremy Corbyn.
But, Mr. Speaker, it is disgraceful that a month has been wasted since we were due to vote on the 11th of December. There can be no further attempts to dodge the accountability of government to this Parliament, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, the right honourable gentleman asked me 3 questions during that response. Does Does the deal still have the confidence of the Cabinet? Yes. Does Cabinet collective responsibility still apply? Yes. Does the Cabinet want to avoid no deal? Yes, the Cabinet wants to ensure that we leave the European Union with a good deal, and that is this deal. The real indecision is the indecision at the heart of a Labour Party that has no plan and no alternative. And the national crisis is an opposition that is irresponsible, that puts its party interests first before the interests of the British people.
Mr. Andrew Mitchell.
It is clear, Mr. Speaker, is it not, that the deal which my right honourable friend has so assiduously negotiated is most unlikely to secure the support of this House of Commons. In these circumstances, does she not think it would be wiser to seek an extension to Article 50?
I'm not having the right honourable gentleman shout it down. I very gently say to a government whip, don't stand near the chair and shout at your colleagues. If you're going to do that, leave the chamber. We'll manage perfectly adequately without you. Mr. Andrew Mitchell.
To seek an extension to Article 50 rather than to leave with no deal.
Can I say to my right honourable friend that I don't think it's right to be seeking that extension of Article 50. I think what Parliament will be faced with is a decision to exercise its responsibility to deliver on the referendum vote, to deliver Brexit. I continue to believe that this is a good deal. Yes, we are seeking those further reassurances, but I continue to believe that we can leave with a good deal and that this is it.
Mr. Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I thank the Prime Minister for advance sight of her statement. But I have to ask, where is the leadership? Yep. The phrase which is often used, we thought the Prime Minister had reached rock bottom, but she's still digging. Mr. Speaker, we have 4 sitting days left in this place before the Christmas recess. We are then left with a narrow window when we return in January to find a way forward out of the government's Brexit timetable. It cannot be done. After 2 years of negotiation, the Prime Minister has designed a deal that she knows that she cannot deliver. Yeah. It doesn't have the support of this House. Yeah. Mr. Speaker, it is time to call time on this government. Yeah. It is a laughingstock. Companies and their workers do not know if we're going to be crashing out of the European Union in 3 months' time. We've just over 100 days. 100 days to prepare for the risk of a no deal that most sensible folk would reject as being unacceptable. The Prime Minister is playing a game of brinksmanship. She is. The European Council President Donald Tusk was clear when he said, "I have no mandate to organise any further negotiations." What more does the Prime Minister need to hear to know that her deal is dead? This is embarrassing. The Prime Minister might be prepared to be embarrassed by the shambles, but the rest of us are not. Parliament needs to take control of this situation and seek to find a solution that prevents a risk to jobs and prosperity. It's the people of our countries that we are talking about. Today, Prime Minister tells us that there are no other options. That is not the case. Standing before Parliament ruling out another referendum on EU membership is an act of desperation from the Prime Minister. Knowing that she cannot get her own deal through this place, the Prime Minister wants to silence debate. Having taken away Parliament's voice, our rights to a meaningful vote, now the Prime Minister wants us to take the right of the people to vote away. Their democratic right to have their say. Their democratic right to change their mind. Mr. Speaker, I plead to the Prime Minister to put all options back on the table. Stop operating in isolation. Reach out and speak with the opposition parties. We all have a responsibility to protect our citizens. It is time, Prime Minister, to move beyond narrow party politics that this place operates with. It is time to operate in the interests of all our nations. I ask the Prime Minister to bring forward the meaningful vote on her deal before the Christmas recess. There is no reason to delay. Let us have that meaningful vote this week. And lastly, will she do the right thing and meet with me and other opposition party leaders this week, collectively? This, Mr. Speaker, is the true test of this government's word. If we are to believe that we are a partnership of equals, then now today we must be heard.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I'm happy to say to the right honourable gentleman, if he wants to come to talk to me about this issue, I'm happy to talk to him about it. But we do have a fundamental difference of opinion that was revealed in the response of his party to what I said in my statement. I believe we should deliver leaving the EU for the British people. He believes we should stay in the EU. So that's a fundamental difference that we have there. He talks about putting jobs and prosperity first. This deal does just that, but it delivers on the referendum while protecting jobs and prosperity. He says he doesn't want to leave with no deal. Well, the only way to ensure that you leave without having no deal is to support a deal. And can I just remind the right honourable gentleman gently that 56% of Scots voted for pro-Brexit parties.
Dame Cheryl Gillen.
The Independent Commission on Referendums published earlier this year and recommended that any second referendum on a subject should be specified in the legislation enabling the first referendum so that the requirement for or possibility of a second referendum and the reason for it is clear to the electorate before the first vote takes place.
Very good.
Would the Prime Minister agree that no such provision was made and that calling for a second referendum at this stage is merely a ruse to try and reverse the result and is not...
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I say to my right honourable friend that I'm grateful to her for pointing that out to the House. Of course, it is absolutely the case that there was no suggestion when the referendum was put to the people in 2016 that there might be a second referendum. People were told, they were led to believe that their vote would be delivered by the government of the time subsequently, and that's what I believe it is certainly in our interests as a government to do, to deliver on that vote and leave the European Union.
Sir Vincent Cable.
The Prime Minister may be aware that the bookmakers has been offering 66 to 1 against a deal passing Parliament, but even money on a referendum and even money on her then winning it. Could it be that the cabinet ministers who were known for preparing for a referendum are not being disloyal to her, but simply better at maths?
Yes.
I'm not sure the right honourable gentleman should spend too much time in the betting shops. I'm not sure the odds on the Liberal Democrats are very good at all.
Sir William Cash.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the Prime Minister confirm, despite the European Council's own so-called legal endorsement of the withdrawal agreement, which they state is not open for renegotiation, that as respects the UK itself, this agreement has not been initialled or signed by herself as Prime Minister and is only a draft, being no more than a political agreement under which nothing is agreed until everything is agreed, including the backstop, and therefore she can still walk away?
I can certainly confirm to my honourable friend that obviously this is a deal that has been negotiated between the UK and the European Union, but it does have to go through certain processes in order to be ratified. Part of that is ratification here in the United Kingdom Parliament, and part is ratification in the European Parliament. And of course it is those processes that lead to the final agreement and the withdrawal agreement.
Mr. Nigel Dodds.
I'm sure the Prime Minister will agree that EU Council conclusions and declarations are, of course, political statements, and they've talked about clarifications, reassurances, but ruled out renegotiating, contradicting or reopening the legal text. Indeed, they even struck out language saying that the backstop didn't represent a desirable outcome for the EU27. So will the Prime Minister today tell us exactly and precisely what she is actually asking for to deliver on the key concerns about the legally binding indefinite nature of the backstop, with no right for this country to exit it on its own terms.
Yes, what I'm asking for is to ensure that we can deal with the concerns that the Right Honourable Gentleman and other members of this House have expressed about the issue of whether the backstop could be indefinite or would be indefinite. So there's two ways to deal with that. The first is to ensure that arrangements are brought in place to ensure the backstop is not triggered in the first place, and the second is to ensure that if it is triggered, then it is only temporary. And it is further assurances, as I said in my statement, political and legal assurances in relation to those issues, which can be achieved in a number of ways, but it's further political and legal assurances in relation to those issues that I'm seeking.
Justine Greening.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As others have said, on Thursday it will be 100 days until Britain leaves the European Union. At the moment we have no deal and no plan B. This is a constitutional crisis because this House is not being allowed to express its will on behalf of our communities who around the country are telling us that they reject this deal. That is why MPs want to be able to vote against it. So can I say to the Prime Minister that it's pointless criticising other members in this House who are coming up with other solutions, whether a second referendum, whether Canada, whether Norway. We are, as a Parliament, trying to find a solution through the political cul-de-sac and mess that we now find this country in. It was clear back in the summer that the Prime Minister's deal was not going to succeed. She now isn't just listening, she's not allowing debate. This is totally unacceptable, and will she agree to bring her vote before this House before Christmas so that she can reflect on the outcome over the Christmas break and then leave?
Well said. I say to my right honourable friend, and I know that she and I think, have a difference of opinion in relation to the issue of a second referendum, but can I say to my right honourable friend that, of course, I've indicated when the vote will be brought back to the House. There will be necessary for the usual channels to agree what the business motion would be and how many days of debate would be available for that. We are not trying to stop debate. What I am trying to do... What I am doing is recognising and reflecting to the European Union the concerns expressed here in this House and seeking ways in which we can ensure that members of this House have sufficient confidence that those particular concerns have been addressed.
Mr. Hilary Benn.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister went to the European Council seeking legal assurances and returned with none. And the next Council meeting scheduled is in the 3rd week of March. Now that Cabinet Ministers are openly speculating about what should happen when her deal is defeated, can she tell the House what purpose it serves to continue to pretend that we might leave the European Union without an agreement when she knows better than anyone else how damaging and disastrous it would be, and when she told the House just now that it would risk the jobs, services and security of the people?
I'll say to the right honourable gentleman that I've responded on this point previously. This House has a responsibility, and it will have a responsibility to come to a decision on this matter and to determine whether to leave the European Union with a deal or to leave without a deal. Or there will be those in this House who will try to ensure that actually we stay in the European Union. I think that would be wrong. I think we should be leaving the European Union because that's what people voted for in the biggest exercise of democracy in our history, and I believe that we should be leaving with a good deal, and this is it.
Why keep parroting their lines?
Mr. Dominic Raab.
The final steps of contingency planning for departure on WTO terms are essential in case EU intransigence continues. Can the Prime Minister confirm that all of those necessary actions are now being taken to see us through any short-term disruption, including action to prepare for extra checks at the border, diversion of flow to friendlier ports, liberalisation of tariff schedules and cutting taxes for businesses?
I say to my right honourable friend, he's trying to tempt me into some budgetary decisions there, which, as he will know, would not be appropriate at this dispatch box. But what I would say to him is that we are making the plans for the contingency arrangements for no deal. As I said in my statement, the Cabinet will be meeting tomorrow to discuss what further steps need to be taken. We have already stepped up those preparations, as my right honourable friend indeed was responsible for himself when he was the Brexit Secretary of State. But further stepping up of those no deal preparations has gone on to address exactly the sorts of issues that he's looking at, such as the flow of traffic into different ports here in the UK, to ease the disruption. Disruption will take place in no deal in the short term. We want to take every step that we can to mitigate that.
Vic Cooper.
The Prime Minister ruled out a customs union, the Prime Minister ruled out Norway, ruled out Canada, ruled out parliamentary votes on her objectives, ruled out parliamentary votes on the options, is ruling out now extending Article 50, and yet everyone knows she does not have support for her plan, and she has no assurances from the EU that she asked for. If she carries on like this, she's the one that will take us over a no-deal cliff. This Christmas, businesses and departments across the country are going to be spending billions of pounds now preparing for no deal. Doesn't she have a duty and a responsibility to them to rule out no deal, to say she will extend Article 50 and have a proper discussion in Parliament to work out the way forward?
I say to the right honourable lady, first of all, she says that we ruled out certain things. Actually, the British people, in the vote that took place in 2016, the majority voted to leave the European Union, and one of the key issues in that was bringing an end to free movement, which some of those suggestions that she has as alternatives would not allow to happen. So actually we're trying to reflect the views that took place during that vote. And the decision as to whether we go forward with the deal or not will be one that this Parliament will take.
Nicholas Soames.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. While my right honourable friend continues to negotiate changes to the backstop, would she agree with me that if those efforts were unfortunately to fail, and if we are to avoid leaving without a deal, which we must at all costs avoid, it must now be critical, will she not agree, that we build a consensus in this House and forge a compromise that delivers Brexit whilst protecting British jobs and interests?
Well, I agree with my right honourable friend that the aim of everything that we are doing and the aim of what this House will do, I believe, should be to ensure that we deliver on that vote and do it in a way that protects jobs and prosperity for people up and down this country. That's exactly what we're working for, and I hope that every member of this House will consider that when it comes to looking at whether or not we should support this deal. I believe we should, because it does exactly what my right honourable friend has suggested.
Liz Kendall.
Let me tell the Prime Minister what is irresponsible. Delaying a vote on her agreement, not because she's going to get any changes to it, but because she wants to run down the clock and try and intimidate MPs into supporting it to avoid no deal. And isn't the reality that this isn't acting in the national interest, but in her personal interest? And neither her party nor the country will forgive her for it.
Can I say to the honourable lady that what I believe would not have been right would be for me not to have listened to the concerns that were expressed in this House. I did listen to those concerns, and I am working and discussions are continuing with the European Union in relation to how we address those concerns, and then it will be for Parliament to decide. But that will be, at that point, Parliament, members of this House, will have a responsibility to determine whether or not the decision that they come to will be about whether or not to deliver on the vote of the referendum in a way that protects jobs and our security.
Sir Michael Fallon.
Given that the Prime Minister has listened and is still trying to improve the deal, would that deal not be more palatable if the timetable for starting on and agreeing the terms of future trade was as firm and as legally binding as the timetable for paying over all the billions?
My right honourable friend makes a very important point. We have achieved, obviously, from the Council conclusions, there has been some further progress in relation to the EU's commitment to the starting the next stage of negotiations. But my honourable friend has raised an issue which is exactly one which I think it is important for us to continue to discuss with them about getting that absolute confirmation and certainty. He refers to legal certainty as to when those negotiations can start and when it is the determination of both parties to ensure those negotiations end. We want that trade deal in place, and I want it in place by the end of December 2020.
Neil Gray. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. She said for 2 years that no deal is better than a bad deal. Of course, now we know why. We know why her deal is a disaster and will never pass this House. So as she desperately tries to let the clock tick down, will she publish her no-deal planning?
I have been clear and I remain clear that no deal is better than a bad deal, but I believe this is a good deal.
John Redwood.
We now publish the tariff schedule for the UK for a WTO exit. Will that include zero tariffs on all components coming in for manufacture here to provide yet another great boost to Britain as a big manufacturing centre?
Obviously, I say to my right honourable friend that these issues are ones that would have to be addressed in relation to a no deal scenario. We are continuing to discuss, as a government, the plans that we need to put in place to deal with the possibility of a no deal in order to mitigate the disruption that would occur in a no deal situation. And obviously, we will be looking closely at the tariff schedules.
Ben Bradshaw.
How much will it cost the NHS, our other public services and thousands of businesses up and down this country as they are forced to activate their no-deal contingency plans because of her reckless time wasting?
Can I say to the right honourable gentleman, responsible government is about ensuring that contingency arrangements are put in place. That is the responsible thing which any government in this situation would do, to ensure that those contingency arrangements are in place until we have the outcome and know with certainty what is happening on the whether we're leaving with the deal or with no deal. We need to make those contingency arrangements. That's the right thing to do.
Esther McVeigh.
Speaker. After tomorrow's Cabinet meeting, where no deal preparations will be high on the agenda, will the Prime Minister please arrange for a minister to come to this House to give a statement this week and then every week until we leave the EU, so that we know what's happening, so the country can be reassured, business and individuals? That is vital. They are happening, and this House needs to know what is happening.
I think, can I say to my right honourable friend that obviously she's raising the important point of information being available to this House and to members of this House on the planning that is taking place. Of course, there are a number of ways in which that is expressed to the House. The Secretary of State for exiting the European Union appears before the Select Committee and responds to issues on that. And of course, these are matters which have been addressed in debates within this House, but I understand the point she's making about wanting to ensure that members of this House are aware of the arrangements that are being put in place.
Frank Field.
The Prime Minister accepts that this House doesn't need more time to debate, but to vote on the various options before it. Might she not therefore agree that we vote as soon as possible on the amendments the Speaker will choose of those tabled? And if she's unwilling to do that, might the opposition parties think how they can use their time they have to debate on the floor of the House to actually bring forward that vote? And if members actually agree with this line of action, might they sign the motion that's on the order paper in my name?
I thank the right honourable gentleman for his question. Obviously, the intention is to have a proper number of days for debate when the vote is brought back in January. At that stage, of course, how the matter is put before the House will depend on the further discussions that have taken place with the European Union. And as we've always said, any motion on this issue is, of course, amendable by members of the House.
Sir Patrick McLaughlin.
We're told the United Kingdom doesn't want the backstop. We're told the European Union doesn't want to enter the backstop. What on earth is stopping the European Union giving us a legal guarantee that such a backstop would only last for a very short time?
Can I say to my right honourable friend, it is exactly that further political and legal assurance that we're looking at in relation to this. There have been very clear statements from the European Union in relation to this. Those have been reiterated after not only in the Council conclusions but after the Council conclusions as well. The best way to stop the backstop coming into place, of course, is to have a firm date for introducing the future relationship. That is currently, the intention is that is currently 31st of December 2020, and we'll be continuing to discuss what further assurances we can get on this point.
Mr. Chris Leslie.
When precisely will the Prime Minister be securing this miracle on 34th Street guarantee from the European Union that she's going to come back with on the backstop before the 7th of January? If she does come back with that, will the House be debating it on a fresh government motion? And in terms of her commitment to come back on the 7th of January to start the debate, is that a promise?
Say to the right honourable gentleman, first of all, the business motion will, of course, and the way in which the debate is to be dealt with by this House will, of course, be discussed with through the usual channels. I said we would be starting that debate in that first week, with a vote in the following week. The right honourable gentleman asked me about the timetable. Discussions are continuing with the European Union, and I expect those to continue into the new year.
Dr. Sarah Wollaston.
Speaker, here's what would do irreparable damage to the integrity of our politics, and that is to run down the clock and to end up forcing through a deal which 48% didn't want because they didn't want to leave the European Union, but also the majority of those who voted for Brexit don't want. Yes. The mathematics of this just simply don't stack up. The majority in this House and in the wider country doesn't want this deal. So can I ask the Prime Minister to get on with it so that we can actually vote on this and then look at practical alternatives?
Say to my honourable friend that, as I've indicated in my statement, we will bring that vote back in the second week in January. It's our intention that debate will start in the previous week, in the first week of January. I think it is important, as I said earlier, that I have listened to the House. I suspect, honourable members, had I not listened to the House and been starting the work to try and get those further assurances from members of this House, then that would have been an issue that people would have raised. I think it's right that I and the government are doing exactly what we said we would, which is working with the EU for those further political and legal assurances.
Pat McFadden.
Mr. Speaker, we now know what the plan is. Having failed to win support for the deal in Parliament and having failed to get any meaningful change to it at the European Council last week, the Prime Minister now simply wants to run down the clock and intimidate Parliament into choosing between a bad deal and the disaster of no deal. I put it to the Prime Minister that it is wrong to threaten and intimidate Parliament in this way. But more importantly, it is reckless to take options off the table, as she's tried to do today, that could prevent the disaster of no deal for the country.
To the right honourable gentleman, whatever the point at which this House face the meaningful vote, it will be a decision for members of this House as to whether to accept the deal or to whether to, there are some who would prefer to see action taken so that we don't leave the European Union. I think that would be wrong. I think it would be right. What I believe is right is that we deliver on the referendum, and the question will be for members of this House as to whether they accept that responsibility to come to a decision. At the moment, there have been lots of ideas around this House about what should happen. No alternatives that actually deliver on the referendum, in a way that protects jobs. That's what the deal does, but it will be a decision for individual members of this House to bear the responsibility that they have.
Sir Oliver Heald.
The Prime Minister will be aware that those of us who have large manufacturing companies in our constituencies, in my case Johnson Matthey in Royston, who do integrated manufacture on a European basis with short supply lines are getting on to people like me saying, look, it's very urgent that we have a deal. Now, when she's negotiating and discussing in Europe with people like Mr Juncker, does she have the feeling that there is that urgent need to get a deal and that they are prepared to listen to what she says and really put in a shift? Because I must say that when I saw him looking so relaxed and really being rather patronising to our Prime Minister, I felt that wasn't really putting in the sort of shift that she has.
Can I say to my right honourable friend that indeed I think, very clear message that comes back from the European Union, from the Commission and EU leaders, is that they do want a deal. We have obviously negotiated this deal. There are those further assurances I'm working to achieve, and it has been made clear by President Juncker and others that those further discussions can indeed take place.
Liz Savile-Roberts.
The Prime Minister knows that no better deal will be found in Europe, and that no majority will be found in Westminster. She also knows no deal is disastrous. She delayed a vote because she knew her deal would fail to get the support it needed. She can employ the same logic again. Will she confirm that she holds the power to seek an extension for Article 50?
It is, of course. Well, first of all, the government does not. The government holds the power to seek an extension for Article 50. Any extension of Article 50 would have to be agreed with the European Union. But I have been clear. I have been clear that what I believe is the right course of action, having triggered Article 50, having undertaken the negotiations, is that we ensure we leave the European Union on the timetable that we've already set out.
Nicky Morgan.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister in her statement talked about empowering this House. But the trouble is that she is asking this House to accept a deferral for several weeks of the meaningful vote on the draft withdrawal agreement on the basis that further assurances can be agreed with the European Union. But there is nothing in what she has said today or what has been reported from the EU Council that those further assurances are likely to be given. And I say this as somebody who was going to vote for her draft agreement on the basis that she has set out that businesses need certainty and the country needs reassurance. I honestly do not think that businesses and employers and our constituents will understand why this House is going on holiday for 2 weeks when we should be having the meaningful vote this week.
I say to my right honourable friend, what I believe is right is that what the government is doing is, having heard the concerns that have been expressed by members of this House, what the government is doing is taking those concerns to the European Union. Yes, we have further statements from the EU with legal status in the Council conclusions than we've had before, but we are seeking yet more and further assurances from the European Union. I think that's the right thing to do. Then that can be debated properly by this House and the vote taken.
Joanna Cherry.
Mr. Speaker, last Thursday the Attorney-General told the House that he was reviewing the question of whether Article 50 could be revoked by a simple vote of this House or by legislation. This Thursday, the Scottish case has been referred back from the Court of Justice to the court in Edinburgh to look at this issue. Can the Prime Minister confirm for us that the Government's position on how Article 50 could be revoked, whether legislation or simply a vote of this House is required, will be set out to the court on Edinburgh on Thursday?
Can I say to the Honourable Lady that I will certainly look into that issue and get back to her on the specifics of that issue in terms of the stance that the Government is taking in relation to the case that is going to the court in Edinburgh. But I know that the Honourable Lady has had considerable interest in the revocation of Article 50. I would simply remind all members of this House that the revocation of Article 50 is something that this Government has said we will not do, because revoking Article 50 means staying in the European Union.
Jonathan Ginogly.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was one of the members who would and will support the Prime Minister's deal. But I have to say, Prime Minister, that what's coming back to me from business, from industry, from the city, is that we are now hemorrhaging support
and investment on a daily basis, and it's getting worse, which is why I add to other honourable members in saying, please do think again in holding this vote, in holding a series of standalone resolutions which mean that we can take a view and move on.
Can I say to my honourable friend, I understand the concern that he's expressing in relation to business. Business wants certainty. Business wants the deal. Business welcomed the deal when we negotiated the deal, and I think they are still taking that approach. He referred to what have, I think, been referred to as indicative votes, a number of motions that could be brought before this House. There are no plans for indicative votes. I have no plans for indicative votes. But can I just say to my honourable friend and to other members of this House that actually what is necessary is for the House to reflect on what members want in terms of their responsibility. In terms of their responsibility to come to a decision on this matter. And at the moment, there are, as I indicated earlier, a number of views around this House. Some want to stay in the EU, some want to go for a second referendum, some would support a no deal, some would support looking at other arrangements. All of those arrangements, any of those arrangements, as I said, that would require a withdrawal agreement, because they would require us to make clear the basis on which we're withdrawing from the European Union.
Angela Smith.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister last week admonished Jean-Claude Juncker for his use of the word nebulous. But there are many people in this House who would take issue with her use of the word meaningful, because there's nothing meaningful about a vote which forces members of this House to choose between her deal and no deal. So when is the Prime Minister going to stop digging, start listening and building a consensus with members across the House to get us out of this mess?
Can I say to the Honourable Lady that it was always going to be the case, whenever the vote came before this House, that members of the House would have a decision as to whether to support the deal that had been negotiated with the European Union or not, with the consequences that failure to support that deal would bring. And that is the same whenever that vote is taken.
And Dr. Julian Lewis.
Does the Prime Minister recall telling the House on the 3rd of December that the £3 to £4 billion set aside in the budget for contingency no-deal planning was about to be allocated in the next few days to relevant departments? Has that allocation been made, and is the money now available for essential contingency planning?
Yes, I do recall saying that. I say to my honourable friend that, of course, the 18-19 financial year allocations are in place and money is being spent. What I think he was referring to, and I was referring to, was the 19-20 allocations. Negotiations on those are well advanced. A number of departments have settled, and we expect to be in a position to confirm all of those shortly.
George Howarth.
Last Friday, a constituent said to me that although she had voted to leave in the referendum in 2016, she now wanted to register the fact that she'd now changed her mind, as she put it, for the sake of her grandchildren. If it emerges that a significant number of people previous Leave voters have reached the same conclusion, which would be more democratic? Allowing them the opportunity to change their mind or press it on regardless?
The right honourable gentleman. And I also hear from people who have in the opposite position. They voted to remain and now say they would vote to leave the European Union. The fact is, the simple fact is, that if there were a second referendum, which came out with the same result, would those honourable members who wish people to be given the chance to think again continue to say that there should be a referendum? If it came out with a different result, I think there would be many people who would say, actually, how many referendums shall we have? How many referenda shall we have? We had the referendum, and I believe it's our duty to deliver on it.
And finishing up our coverage of British Prime Minister Theresa May on the Brexit negotiations, the Prime Minister will be back to answer questions from members of the House of Commons on Wednesday, starting at 7 a.m. Eastern here on C-SPAN 2. We'll go live now